Now it's live, ma'am.
Okay, sir. Just sir, we ready to begin, sir? Should we
Absolutely ready. I'm ready when you are.
begin? Okay, sir. Thank
Now
you.
it's live.
Okay, sir. A very good afternoon to everyone who have joined us today. I, on behalf of my entire organizing team, would like to welcome Professor Santosh Mehrotra, sir, our honorable resource person for the day, my colleagues, and all the participants to day 8 of this faculty refresher course. Santosh Mehrotra, sir, is professor in Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. I have had the privilege to be his student, and therefore I can speak endlessly for him. I indeed would take a couple of minutes to introduce him in best of my knowledge. Sir has an MA in economics from New School for Social Research, New School University, New York, and PhD in economics from Cambridge. Professor Santosh Mehrotra, sir, is a human development economist whose research and writings have had most influence in the areas of labor, employment, skill development, child poverty, and in the economics of education. He brings a combination of professional experience with the Indian government as a policy maker and advisor, and with the international organization as a technical expert. Having lived in 3 continents and traveled to 63 countries, providing a technical advice to governments, and as an academic whose research work has been translated into many languages and have helped many countries like Mandarin, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, German, and I am sure the list continues. From 1991 to 2006, Sir has spent 15 years with United Nations agencies, 2 United Nations agencies, UNICEF and UNDP. Sir was the chief economist of the Global Human Development Report. Before that, he had led research program on developing countries at UNICEF's Global Research Institute, Italy. After returning to India, Sir has led the Rural Development Division and Development Policy Division in Planning Commission from 2006 to 2009. Sir has authored several chapters in India's 11th and 12th five-year plan. Sir was also Director General, Institute of Applied Manpower Research in Planning Commission 2009 to 2014. Sir has also held a 3-year appointment as Parkin Visiting Professor at the Center for International Development in the Faculty of Social Sciences, Bath University, UK from 2010 to 13. And his list of extensive work and immense contribution to academics and policy making continues. Sir, please pardon my knowledge if I have misquoted any information or have skipped anything. It's our privilege to have you with us today, sir. On this note, I would like to invite Professor Santosh Kumar Mehrotra, sir, to elucidate on COVID-19 and world of work, the impact of pandemic in India. We would like to inform you, sir, that our participants have joined us on YouTube live, and all the participants can post their queries in the comment section while the session is going on, and we will take them at the end of the session. On to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Bhavna. I'm delighted to be part of your refresher course. I just wanted to tell you and our audience that I'm no more with JNU since August of last year. I am back as visiting professor at the University of Bath. You mentioned Bath, and I'm back there. So anyway, that's the only correction I would offer you. But that's neither here nor there. Let me very quickly welcome all our participants. I just want to say that I plan to speak for about 30 or 35 minutes, and then we'll have hopefully plenty of time for discussion. We've already shared a paper with you. This paper of mine is already coming out next month in the Indian Economic Journal. It's called An Alternative Fiscal Package to Mitigate India's COVID economic crisis. So let me start without much ado, without losing any more time. Let me begin by saying that, you know, after the Great Depression of 1929, this is about the worst economic crisis that the world has faced. This one comes, unfortunately, on top of a global pandemic and a health crisis. Therefore, the actions that need to be taken by governments have to be correspondingly dual-pronged. Faced by the collapse of European and the US economies post the Great Depression of 1929, John Maynard Keynes, who I'm sure all of you have read, Keynes wrote the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money in 1936, which became so influential that he came to be seen as the savior of capitalism, or the man who allowed for the great post-Second World War expansion of government. Now, since the end of the Second World War, from 45 to about the mid-70s, we saw a great revival of Europe and North America. Dramatic growth took place, and that led in turn to a reaction from the neoliberals. And that neoliberal counter-revolution came around the late 70s, early 80s. And many economists, especially the neoliberal ones, had hoped that Keynes's influence had waned after the neoliberal counter-revolution, and waned particularly in the 1990s and the 2000s. However, the 2007-8 financial crisis saw the return of the master, in fact, the Return of the Master is the title of a biography of Keynes written by Lord Skidelsky in the UK. And we know that the post-2008 crisis intervention by governments it's now accepted that it was the intervention by governments that averted another great depression like the 1929 depression. So Keynes's ideas really came back post-2008, and they came back with a vengeance in most of the advanced economies, advanced capitalist economies. However, unfortunately, it seems not in India. The post-2008 stimulus by the then Indian government was quite strong, and I will come back to that a little later. But post-2014, it seems that despite the fact that the economy had slowed post-2014, and now we are facing the worst economic crisis of India since independence in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. We seem to have forgotten Keynes, although the advanced capitalist economies have again gone back to Keynesian measures. It's something that I will come back to very shortly. And this is particularly tragic for us because we still have the largest number of poor in the world. And we still have a per capita income of under $2,000 per capita. A fraction of that of the BRICS, of even the BRICS economies, of which there is going to be a summit in exactly a week's time. We will hear about it very shortly. Now, so what I'm going to do and what I do in this paper is ask two questions. One, the first question is, why has the collapse of the Indian economy in the post-pandemic period been among the worst among the G20 countries? Because you really need to understand that it has been the worst, and I'll come back to that. And the second question I ask in this paper is this: how could the stimulus package of the government of India be different to enable a recovery that is faster than we are likely to see? And so I will have I will have an opportunity to discuss these things. And so let me start straight away by discussing the pre-pandemic economic slowdown in the period prior to 2020, which I have argued in what I've written was a structural slowdown. Now, was the economic slowdown prior to the 2020 period, 2020 pandemic, a structural one or a cyclical one was already being debated. I want to remind you that for post-demonetization and then the unplanned sudden introduction of the GST across the country without a pilot, there had been a slowdown in 9 quarters prior to March 2020. Every quarter, the economy had slowed until the growth had fallen in the last quarter, January to March 2020, to 3.6%. Now, the question that was being asked at that point was this slowdown a structural one or a cyclical one? And I would argue now, and as I've done in the paper, that this was a structural slowdown. Let me explain why. You see, if you look at the global environment post-2014, it's something very important had happened globally, and that was a sharp fall in commodity prices post-2014. Until 2014, until the previous government was in power, the oil prices were in the region of $120 to $150 per barrel. And yet, despite a global economic crisis of 2008, despite this commodity oil prices being as high as they were, this is important because 80% of our oil is imported. Despite these, in the period 2004 to 14, the GDP growth rate was 8% per annum. And what happens after 2014 is a slowdown, which is what so what were the causes here? Now, let's just step back for a minute and understand what the real drivers of GDP are. There are 4 of them. 1, private consumption. The 2nd, private investment. The 3rd, exports. And the 4th is government expenditure, particularly both consumption as well as investment. So let me deal with each one of these drivers and see what was happening to these drivers. The surest indicator that slowdown prior to the pandemic was a structural one is that real wages, both rural and urban, had been flat between 2012 and 2018, which is the exact opposite of what was happening between 2004 and 2012. Primarily because non-agricultural job growth had been very low post-2012 compared to the earlier period. You see, in the earlier period, from 2004-5 to 11-12, we were adding 7.5 million new non-farm jobs every year. And so the open unemployment rate was barely 2.2% over that period. So please understand, we were adding only 2 million people to the labor force, but 7.5 million new non-farm jobs were being added. And that non-farm job growth since 2012 had fallen to below 3 million from 7.5 million. Now, you see, if only 2 million people were joining the labor force, but 7.5 million new non-farm jobs were being created, then where were the people coming from? Well, they were coming from agriculture. For the first time in India's history, post 2004-5, we got a situation where the absolute number of workers in agriculture was falling. So people were being pulled out of agriculture, and the absolute number of workers in agriculture was falling, which resulted in a tightening of the rural labor market, which raised real wages. So non-farm, on the one hand, jobs grow, non-farm. On the other hand, the labor market tightens in rural areas. Rural wages begin to rise. As real wages begin to rise in rural areas, that has a ratchet effect on urban wages as well. So consumption increases dramatically, poverty declines. Post 2014, because job growth fell, before the pandemic, the job you get only under 3 million new non-farm jobs being created. So what do we see between 2012 and 2018-19 in respect to wages? That real wages remain flat, whether it is for casual workers or for regular workers. They remain flat or they fall. They had earlier been rising. That's what drove the increase in consumption and drove the decline in poverty. Now, the implication of this is, in other words, jobs falling, wages falling. I'm still talking about pre-pandemic. I will come to the pandemic in a minute. The result of this was the following. You see, you know that there are three components of national savings. One is corporate savings, the second is public savings, government savings, the third is household savings, and household savings account for the majority, for most of the national savings. Now, the interesting thing is that with wages and incomes coming down post 2012, people were able to maintain consumption only by cutting savings. So household savings actually fell from 24% of GDP in 2012 to 17% of GDP in 2018-19, and it has only fallen since then. These are 17% of GDP for household savings are levels which prevailed in the early 1990s, which is a quarter of a century ago. So the first driver of growth was stuttering. Second, because over this period, private corporate savings had been rising. It's interesting. Household savings are falling, but private corporate savings rose. I don't have the time to go into why. Rose from 9.5% in 2012 to 11.5% of GDP in 2019. But despite this growth, there was no appetite for private investment to grow. There were no animal spirits. The environment was not such to encourage greater investment. So investment to GDP, the second driver of growth, which was 31% of GDP in 2013-14, fell consistently and even before the pandemic. And my estimate for FY21 that suggests that it is likely to be below 25%. So second driver. Third driver, exports. Exports had been in a tailspin from 2013-14 to 2019, downwards. You won't believe this, perhaps. Merchandise exports were lower over 2014-18 each year than in 2013-14 in US dollar terms. The result was, as a share of GDP, they fell from 17% in 2013-14 to 11.5% in 17. So you're saying what I'm saying is that there was a series of policy failures. And finally, the fourth driver of aggregate demand, which is government expenditure. Was it expanding? Could it have expanded? Well, tragedy is there was already a silent fiscal crisis by 2018-19. And non-discretionary revenue expenditure left little elbow room, was because of revenue expenditure, which is non-discretionary being high, little room for capital expenditure. And then on top of this, in this situation, you get a demonetization which knocks the bottom out of the unorganized sector. Then you get an unplanned GST 6 months later, and you knock the bottom out of even the organized sector. And then, just soon after 2019 elections, the government cuts corporate income tax. When you are already facing a silent fiscal crisis, when GST is hardly stabilizing for 2 years, which is an exogenous shock to the system. On top of demonetization, the government cuts corporate income tax, what hoping private investment will revive, but did it? Of course it didn't. In that environment, was it going to revive? Anyone who understands macroeconomics 101 would understand that it wouldn't revive. Meanwhile, since 2015 onwards, the government was focusing its own public expenditure on welfare spending with an explicit voter appeal. Like what? Rural housing, toilets. I have no problem with toilets. Point is, when you do toilets and rural housing at the cost of health or education, then there's a problem. Or to cash farmers, cash transfers to farmers, PM Kisan, or free gas connections to the poor. So you have your revenues are not rising, and you are focusing your expenditure on based on explicit voter appeal, while at the same time, basic social services like health, education, integrated child development scheme, the midday meal scheme for school children, all getting squeezed. This is before the pandemic. These are the factors, the drivers of growth, and they were all shrinking prior to the pandemic. Now, let's turn to the pandemic. When the pandemic broke, on March 25, the government announced a lockdown, a national lockdown. And the government announced it at 4 days' notice. South Africa also announced a national lockdown around the same time. It gives 4 days' notice. The result was suddenly migrant workers who did not wish to contract the disease in urban areas because they were locked down without livelihood and they were living 4 to a room. They had lost their livelihood. Suddenly they started walking back to their homes. So the lockdown was too sudden. The lockdown, secondly, was too early. There were less than 500. There were less than 600 cases. How many cases do we have now? 20 million. Do we have a lockdown now? No, we don't have a lockdown. But then one person announces a lockdown at 4 hours notice, and even the state governments were completely taken by shock. It was unplanned, and that is evident from the following fact that till July, the government data was showing that 80% of cases were still in only 9 cities. Only 20% of the cases were in the rest of the country. That means had you locked down those 9 cities, because these had international airports, that's where the disease was coming in from. You should have focused your attention on those 9 cities. It would never have spread. Once you unlocked from about July onwards, the Shramik trains began. You allowed the people to spread all over the country, and community transmission took place. And why are you then surprised that by August, the share of 9 cities had fallen to 50%, and the rest of the country was now accounting for the remaining 50%. And that's why you get a peak in August, September. That's how you get a peak, the first wave. Thirdly, the lockdown was national in scope. Did China do a national lockdown? No. China only locked down Wuhan city, where the problem began. Then they locked down Hubei province, of which Wuhan is the capital. They then locked down Shanghai and Beijing, and they prevented travel from taking place from Wuhan to the rest of the country, but they allowed travel to take place from all parts of the country to other parts of the country. In other words, the lockdown was very focused. It was very subnational. What did we do? We went for a national lockdown. Did we consult the epidemiologists? No. Why should we? We know everything in any case ourselves. It's not just that. This is just problem number 3. You know that the Oxford University has the Britannic School of Government, which was monitoring the lockdown of governments. across the globe. We had the most stringent lockdown. They had criteria for measuring the stringency of the lockdown. Among all countries of the world, India's lockdown was the most stringent. Was there any logic for that? No, none whatsoever. So too early, unplanned, national in scope unnecessarily, and the most stringent why, we don't know. The health impact of this mismanagement and poor planning was inevitable. It led to the spread of the disease. The country was in lockdown till the 1st of May. When the Shramik trains began, they carried migrant workers back to their homes and carried the disease everywhere. The impact, let me turn very quickly to the economic impact. The economic impact was the following: that our economic impact on account of the nature of our lockdown led to a collapse of output and jobs across the whole country. And important to understand that it was the worst economic impact in terms of output loss in the G20 countries. Of all countries, ours was the worst. Why? We have to ask ourselves the question, why was it the worst? I've given you part of the explanation of why it was the economic impact was the worst, but let me now very quickly turn to even more serious mistakes, and now I take you back to why in India, macroeconomics 101 is not understood by our leadership, and Keynes has been forgotten. Because what we got, and I've done this analysis in the paper, and you will see this analysis, that our fiscal stimulus was very small, but you need to appreciate and understand that I examined the international literature and found that there is a very clear relationship. It's not that other countries didn't do lockdowns. There's a clear relationship between lockdowns and their stringency and economic impact. There's a clear negative correlation, particularly between the stringency of the lockdown measures and real GDP growth. The IMF has demonstrated this, and we got precisely that. This is what is discussed in the paper. Another tragedy is that the IMF's analysis across the countries also finds that there are unequal effects of the lockdown across gender and across age groups. Women are more affected, women lose more jobs. I don't have the time to go into reasons why. The young, particularly, are worst affected. So what we have, in other words, in summary, is the worst economic impact in FY 2021. That means 2021 of all G20 countries. Now let's look at the nature of the peer country stimulus, and then I'll turn to the Indian stimulus because I don't want to take too much time. I have a table in the paper in section 3 which actually compares the size of the fiscal stimulus, the monetary stimulus, and the credit stimulus by groups of countries. India is in the first column, the second column has emerging market economies, and the third column has developed economies. Now, look at the numbers here. They are actually shockingly different for India on the one hand, even against the emerging market economies. India's fiscal spend, was 2.2% of GDP in FY21. Compare that to India's fiscal stimulus post-2008 global economic crisis. I was part of government. I was in the planning commission when we put together a package of 3.5% of GDP at a time when the crisis was much smaller. This is a crisis which is much deeper. And what is the size of the fiscal stimulus we put in place? 2.2% of GDP. The emerging market economies' average size, as I will explain to you, and this is average, and I will come to Brazil, South Africa, China in a minute. The EME's average fiscal stimulus was 4.7% of GDP. For developed countries, it was 8.5% of GDP. What did we do? 2.2% of GDP. But look at what the size of our monetary stimulus was, 6% of GDP, compared to emerging market economies, only 1.6%. And the credit stimulus was 7%. Our credit stimulus was 7% of GDP. That's how government came up with the full number, 29 lakh crores, 15% of GDP. जोड़ लीजिए तीनों को, of which 2.2% is fiscal and 7% is credit stimulus. When no one wants to borrow, how will people want to borrow? When the aggregate demand was already collapsing earlier, and I'm saying aggregate demand collapses because jobs disappear overnight. Wages fall sharply. So the macroeconomics 101 teaches us, Keynes teaches us, you are supposed to support aggregate demand. What you have here is a supply shock, but at the same time, there's an aggregate demand shock. And what you are attempting to do is to support supply further by giving a credit stimulus, etc. Why is anyone going to borrow if there's no demand for their products? So small firms kept collapsing. They're still collapsing. Anyway, I've already spoken for about 28 minutes, and I will just be brief from this point on, because I want to finish in the next 5 or 7 minutes. What did China do? Because I began by talking about China. You need to understand what the Chinese did. You need to understand why. Because you heard the latest news that China's growth in FY20, their FY20, they go from January to December, was still positive. They were the only major economy in the world which was positive, which was in positive territory. The reasons you partly I've explained, partly you will see now. Their fiscal stimulus was 4.7% of GDP. Similarly, Brazil, another BRICS country, to mitigate the impact of COVID-19, the authorities announced a series of fiscal measures adding up to 12% of GDP. 12, 6 times ours. South Africa, another BRICS country, right? These are the countries we like comparing ourselves to, no? The South African government announced a social relief and economic support package of 500 billion rand, which is around 10% of GDP. 10. I won't say more. Let me say that I've already told you what the size of our stimulus was. I won't go more in depth into this. I want to just close, and this is my last section in the paper. What other fiscal measures were required to revive aggregate demand, and they could still be taken? They have not been taken. The tragedy is that the country is undergoing colossal suffering on a daily basis. And the government didn't even anticipate a second wave. We were announcing to the world in January, to the World Economic Forum, the Prime Minister said, we have won the war against Corona. We are going to spread vaccines all over the world. Where are we now? There is no sign of a fiscal stimulus, even now. There wasn't in the budget of FY21 of 1st of February. There wasn't. Not even in health, as I will explain to you in a minute. I will explain how the health budget, so-called increase, was a fudge beyond belief. I'm sure you understand now the empirical and the theoretical logic of putting in place a fiscal stimulus, because if you don't put it in place, you cannot get a revival of aggregate demand, and that's what you need to do. Because if you don't revive aggregate demand, joblessness, which worsened through the 2020 period, it worsened on top of the highest open unemployment rate in 2019 that the country had experienced in 45 years, since the first time we started collecting data through labor force survey on jobs. The open unemployment rate had jumped from 2.2% in 2012 to 6.1%. And youth unemployment, which should interest you and your students, youth unemployment had gone between 2012 and 2019 from 6%, tripled to 18%. If you were a graduate, and many of you teach graduates, it had gone from 18% in 2012 to 36%. If you were a technical graduate, it had gone from about 17% to 35%. If you were a PG, it had increased equally. This is prior to the pandemic. Prior. So what are the nature of the fiscal stimuli that we need currently? I make an argument in the paper for increasing capital expenditure. Please remember that, if you're aware of the distribution of the responsibility in the government of capital expenditure, it falls mainly on state governments. State governments account for 3.5% of GDP roughly together of public expense on capital expenditure, while the federal government, the central government, accounts for only 1.2%, 1.3%. So, in other words, the greatest responsibility lies with the central government, with the state governments, and because there had been a silent fiscal crisis prior to the pandemic, the government should have been borrowing more. The government was forced to borrow more, but it could have and should have borrowed much more than it in fact did. Because had it done so and put that money into capital expenditure, it would have revived the infrastructure investment. And infrastructure investment draws in, pulls in, crowds in private investment. And when that happens, it creates jobs in construction. Please remember that construction jobs have been the fastest growing sector from 2004-05 onwards in terms of employment in our economy, which is the main reason why workers were getting pulled out of agriculture post 2004-05 I mentioned to you. Do you know how many workers were in the construction sector in 2004-05 only? 26 million. In 7 years, by 2012, that number had doubled to 51 million. That number continued to increase, but increased very slowly. This was the time to increase your capital expenditure. The government has hardly increased capital expenditure. It has done so in the FY22 budget. We will wait to see what kind of impact it will have. Because now the government is going to have to spend on the second wave, which it didn't prepare for. Had it prepared for it, I think we wouldn't have been spending so much in any case. Next, I told you that jobs collapsed, wages collapsed, incomes collapsed. The government did put in place 500 rupees for JDY bank holders for 3 months. Not good enough. Not enough at all. Because I haven't told you, if you read the paper, you will understand, each of those 3 countries have cash transfers, the BRICS countries, on top of, prior to the beginning of the crisis. And they've added funds to that. We didn't add any funds to PM Kisan in any case, and PM Kisan is a highly regressive scheme, I should say. Why is it regressive? Let me explain. PM Kisan is confined to owner cultivators in rural areas. It is not given to tenant farmers. It is certainly not given to landless labor. The rural crisis and the agricultural crisis in our economy over the decades has been increasing, the result of which has been that the total number of landless labor in rural areas in our country exceeds the total number of tenant farmers plus owner cultivators. Just the landless labor exceeds. But here in this case, even tenant farmers don't get it. On the other, so this is one dimension of the lack of progressivity of PM Kisan. In fact, the regressivity, let me take it a little step further. Why is it regressive? Because what it did was that if I have a brother, and so far we've been tilling the land as owner cultivators, and I haven't actually split my land with my brother. We just sort of, लेखपाल के यहाँ लिखाई नहीं करी थी, नाम लिखवा बदलाया नहीं किया, mutation नहीं हुआ. But now when I know that I'm going to get 6,000 rupees under PM Kisan, I go and get the mutation done. We're still the same farmers. And now I'm getting 6,000 and my brother is getting 6,000. How wonderful. But the tenant farmer is not getting it. The landless labor is not getting it. And the urban poor is getting nothing. So the argument I make, and there is a paper of mine which is on the ICRIER website, which is called the Minimum Income Guarantee, a way of raising aggregate demand post-pandemic. So I make an argument for a minimum income guarantee, a cash-in transfer, which is on a sustained basis for the same amount, 500 rupees a month, but a sustained basis. I don't want to take more time. I want to finish as quickly as possible. Third, I make a case for, in addition to Manrega, because demand for Manrega work is shot through the roof. And in this budget, the government has already cut funds. Even last year, there were, as workers went back from urban areas, migrant workers went back, demand exceeded supply. So So in the month of September, for instance, just take one example of last year, 80 million person days of work was demanded, but only 62 million person days was given. That means 18 million person days were not given. When you needed to really give work to everyone because everyone had lost incomes. So the third thing I would have put in place now is this. And finally, health, because this is a health crisis. And as I'm going to say just 2 or 3 sentences there. And if you want to ask me questions later, I can answer that. One, over the last 5 years, real health expenditure by the central government has actually declined in the run-up to the crisis. In this budget, in FY 21-22, we were given the impression that there's been an increase in the budget. Fact of the matter is that the increase is only on account of the 35,000 crores allocated for the COVID vaccine, which is inevitable that was going to be needed. It's another story that even that has been made into a mess by differential pricing. It's a public good. Health is a public good. If a public good is supposed to be provided at the same price or free, completely free, that's what you need, especially in a country which is just so many millions of poor, especially in a country where historically the government has been spending only 1.3% of GDP on government expenditure on health, so that most of the health interventions or health interaction of ordinary citizens like you and me, including in rural areas, are with private providers. This is an unacceptable situation. But even in this situation, the government has actually not increased allocations. In order to present the budget as though it has increased the amount, it actually added water and sanitation expenditures to the health budget when the finance minister spoke to the parliament on the 1st of February. and made it seem as though there's been a massive increase in the health expenditure. Fact of the matter is there's an actual decline in the non-COVID expenditures, because you don't add in health, water and sanitation. Water and sanitation is a separate line item. Has always been so. You just added it in saying, बढ़ा दिया. If under these circumstances, when you were announcing to the rest of the world, we have won the pandemic war, and this was the nature of the health allocation on the 1st of February, why are you surprised? For all these reasons, I still make an argument for a larger fiscal stimulus comparable to the one, at least comparable to the one which we put in place at the time of the global economic crisis. The government needs to borrow more. The paper discusses how more resources could be mobilized. In the interest of time, I'm going to stop and open myself up to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. So we'll just take up the questions from YouTube and...
You're muted, Bhavna.
Yes, sir, I'll do that. Sir.
You're muted, Beta.
Right.
Thank you. Wait a second. Just give me a second. Sorry, my mic had gone. My speakers had gone. So sorry, I can hear. Sorry, go ahead.
So, sir, one question is, with the outbreak disrupting global supply chains, what steps has the government taken to ensure that India does not see any shortage of drug and medical equipment other than banning exports?
Well, let's start with oxygen, because that's the dire need of the day. Had we prepared and planned for a second wave, I don't think we would have faced this crisis, because we produce enough oxygen. And it is perfectly easy to actually divert industrial oxygen to medical purposes, which is what the government is now doing, better late than never. One of the main reasons for the tragedy that is happening now is not just poor planning, it's also the fact that we have logistical issues, because most of the supply of industrial oxygen in our country is in the eastern part of the country, while the pandemic is national in scope. It's the particular needs and demands have shot up in Delhi and Maharashtra, in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, in Gujarat. So you can see you can't get more distant from the oxygen than that. This is big problem number one. I think big problem number two is the poor planning on the vaccines. Can anyone in government explain why we decided to export 66 million doses of vaccines between January and March, when our own people got only 30 million? We wanted to be the good Samaritans in the world. That's not a bad idea, as long as you're taking care of your own extremely poor people. You may have sent, I was reading the New York Times this morning, and you may have sent vaccines to Congo. And Congo or Côte d'Ivoire is not being able to actually utilize all that because they hadn't prepared. After having received all these vaccines, they hadn't prepared their own infrastructure. So you managed to, either through COVAX, the WHO initiative, or through your own exports, you've done that. The point one, in respect of vaccine. Secondly, every major government of the world, especially the US, especially in Europe, they all placed advanced orders on their vaccine manufacturers. Did we? No. We didn't place advanced orders for vaccines. Not until January. Did we not know? Did we not know that we have 1.34 billion people and that some 800 to 900 million of those have to be vaccinated? that our own needs, in other words, if we assume that we need 800 million people to be vaccinated, because that, unless you get there, you're not going to get herd immunity. And if you're going to, in any case, if you're going to take that long to get to herd immunity, what is going to happen is that the virus will mutate, and that's exactly what has been happening. So we should have focused on that. So you didn't even think about the mutation. Why? You were not listening to the epidemiologists. What were the epidemiologists? Why weren't the epidemiologists speaking up loudly and shouting on the top of their voices that in the US and Europe, genome sequencing is being done? What is genome sequencing? You see, this is a clever virus. It is bound to mutate. It mutates more in countries where the infection rate is very high. And our infection rate is very high. So it is already mutating. So all the discussion in the newspapers is about, is it 1.6.1, 6.7, is it 1.6.8? Question is, you can actually find out if there is genome sequencing of the virus going on a large enough scale. When you test and you get positive people, you use that, and those who are getting treated as well, you use that data to do backward gene sequencing, is to find out, is the virus mutating or not? Because if you discover in time, you act. But the point is, if you've not been doing enough genome sequencing, we started our process of genome sequencing only in January. The Europeans and the North Americans were doing their genome sequencing in vast numbers in 2020 itself. So I could go on. There is a failure upon failure upon failure. It is not for nothing that it is a catastrophe. The world is not only pitying us at a time when we were claiming, we had claimed in January to the world that we have conquered, and we will now supply vaccines to the rest of the world. I could go on, but I'm stopping to allow other people to ask questions.
Right, sir. Sir, there is another question. What's the way out where we need to protect economy and control COVID-19? Sir, I'm sure Chinese model will not work for India. Do you think that RBI stimulus package will revive economy to beat second strain of COVID-19 and face the third strain?
I think I already said in my lecture that we put in place among the largest credit stimulus through RBI action among any country in the world, in particularly emerging market economies. You first have to revive demand, sir, if you've done economics. I have been saying that you have to revive demand is giving more liquidity, giving more freedom to the banks to lend more. Is that going to suddenly revive demand? That's the real question, sir. That's the real question. I assume that you're talking about yesterday's RBI actions. Why don't you ask this question? You already put in place a 6 to 7% of GDP stimulus from the RBI last year. Has it revived the economy? The government was claiming there is a V-shaped recovery taking place. Is it? It was a rebound. When your economy contracts by over 10%, then when the lockdown ends, the economy rebounds. That's all that is happening. When your base goes down, then this year you might have had, assuming that there was going to be no second wave, you might have had sort of something like 10% growth this year. That means you might have gone back to the absolute level of GDP of 1920. That's what it means. But would we have gone back to the absolute level of per capita GDP? No, because every year our population is still growing at 1% per annum. In other words, even after a full V-shaped recovery that the government is claiming was likely to be happening in FY22, we would be only back to 17, 18 per capita income levels. So when are we going to recover the trajectory of growth that we could have achieved? We are very far away from that. Very, very far away from that. So in the best case scenario, if we are able to control the second wave and we are a little bit better prepared for the third wave, and we try and take the fiscal actions that I am talking about, there is a possibility that in 3 years' time, we might return to a positive growth rate of 5% per annum, which is not even what this government was achieving in the first 2 years of its term. Forget the previous government. And you know what the implication of that is? You've already seen, you will continue to see massive decline in capacity, meaning small firms are closing down. Large listed companies are buying out small firms. What you are seeing, in other words, is large firms taking over small firms. And so there is more concentration of economic power taking place as we speak. At the same time, please recall that listed companies actually made a profit last year at a time when workers had seen a dramatic fall in incomes and jobs. So on the one hand, what you are seeing and will continue to see an improvement in certain parts of the organized sector, not even all parts of the organized sector, as opposed to the unorganized sector. First. Second, you are seeing incomes of larger companies, listed companies, improving while workers' incomes are falling and shrinking. That's a second dimension of what I call a K-shaped recovery and not a V-shaped recovery. A K-shaped recovery. K. Now, a K-shaped recovery in an extremely unequal country, in a very unequal country, if you're interested in Gini coefficients of income in our country, our Gini coefficients are not much better than that of Brazil, and Brazil is among the worst in the world, already prior to the pandemic. And you are seeing greater inequality happening now. Why do you even believe that we are going to see a recovery to 5% growth before 5 years? You will not. Because in order for rapid growth to be achieved on a sustained basis, the market size must keep expanding, which is what was happening until 2014. The market size was expanding. Why? Because jobs, non-farm jobs were growing. The labor market in rural areas was tightening, and real wages were rising in both rural and urban areas. That's how consumption was increasing, and that's how the absolute number of the poor fell for the first time in the history of India between 2004-5 and 2011-12 by 140 million. That's 20 million people rising above the poverty line every year. I have done estimates of what has happened to poverty until 2019, and now I'm in the process of doing estimates on what has happened to poverty during the pandemic. And it is horrendous. It is horrendous. Please go and read the State of Working India 2021, a report just published and on the website of the Azim Premji University Center for Sustainable Employment, just released last year, and get a sense of the reality as opposed to the propaganda that you're constantly subjected to on media.
Great, sir. Thank you, sir. Sir, if we could take a few more questions.
Sure.
Okay, sir.
And I'll try to be brief from this point onwards if I'm taking longer than necessary. Please go ahead.
From April to December 2020, government central supply food grains to BPL and some APL families. Also free for 3 months to about 80 crore individual. Does it give relief to mass of population?
Yes, it's a good thing, certainly. And thankfully, the government has now extended that again. Why should we be surprised? Do you know what the size of our stock is? The Food Corporation of India and state warehousing corporations have a stock currently of 90 million metric tons, when the country needs no more than 40 million metric tons. In other words, there is a cost being borne by the government of India and the state governments of simply warehousing this. If you hold it for too long, rats will eat it. One. Two, because you don't have the storage capacity in our warehouses. This grain is stored in open spaces with tarpaulin, under tarpaulin sheets. When the rain falls, the bottom layers begin to rot. And then the FCI, what it does with the rotting thing is it sells it to local tharrawalas who make tharra with it. Can you imagine the amount of money that is made there? Over the table, under the table, who knows? So the government is not just doing itself a favor, but it is doing the people a favor. There's no question about it. It has to do it. There is no getting away from it. Otherwise, there is a likelihood with incomes having fallen. Why are incomes falling? Why am I saying this repeatedly? Please try and appreciate the economic logic here. For the first time in 15 years, from 2004 to 2019, the absolute number of workers in agriculture was falling. Thanks to the pandemic, millions of workers have gone back. We don't have good estimates of how many millions of workers have gone back. So if the number of workers was already in surplus prior to 2004-05 and even until 2019, people were still leaving. Now, if people have gone back in larger numbers, that means the number of the surplus has gone up. So instead of the labor market tightening, which it was doing post 2004-05, it has actually become a labor market which is flush with workers. So real wages will fall. Real wages falling might prevent people from dying from hunger, but it will also constrain all non-essential expenditure. Non-essential expenditure essentially mean manufacturers. In other words, if manufacturing demand does not resume or does not revive, why do you think capacity utilization of India's industry, which had fallen below 60% last year, is going to go up to 70% or even 80%? Because only when capacity utilization rises to something like 80% plus does private investment revive. It doesn't. Why should it revive prior to 80% capacity utilization? I've already told you what happened to savings. And savings would have declined even further. We don't have the estimates just yet. Much would have fallen below the 17% of GDP, household savings as a proportion of GDP. People are dissaving. They're selling their gold. They must be selling their land. They're selling their cattle. I'm talking about rural areas. In urban areas, it's happening all the time because they are being completely slaughtered by the health expenditures. You've got sudden health expenditures. Did the government increase expenditure on health? No. Should it have?
Okay, thank you, sir. So there's one more question. India is facing very high employment in many sectors. Why is there a shortage of labor in agriculture? And what are your suggestions to increase the number of works or jobs in India during COVID period? I think that's what they're trying to say.
I didn't, this is a This is news to me. That there is a shortage of workers in agriculture. Please, who wants to explain? Someone who wants to explain this can explain that to me, because I'm saying the exact opposite. There's too much work, too many workers, too many workers. Where is the shortage? People may be refusing on certain farms to work on wages which are perhaps even below Manrega. That's what you are interpreting as a shortage of labor. How can there be a shortage of labor if millions have gone back to their farms? How can there be? You please explain this to me. It doesn't stand to logic. It's not that I have not heard from certain landowners in UP who are of course members of parliament. ये सब काम नहीं करना चाहते, वापस आगे काम नहीं करना चाहते. अरे आप you are taking you as a landlord are probably taking advantage of the wages that you want to pay, given that millions have come back. You're probably trying to pay wages which are below even Manrega. So they're going to wait for Manrega work. They won't work. They can do some other work, non-farm work they will do. So what do you, I mean, I'm just in a state of shock that you even think that there is a shortage of labor in rural areas. I've spent a whole hour saying to you, is the exact opposite has been happening. I've just said to you, for the first time in India's history, in 15 years of India's history, there's been an absolute increase in the number of workers in agriculture, which is the opposite of what a developing country should be undergoing. What is the meaning of development? The meaning of development is structural transformation. What is structural transformation? It has two dimensions. That the share of industry and services in total output, in total GDP, is increasing and the share of agriculture is declining. A simultaneous development is supposed to be taking place when development happens in respect of the workforce. That the share of the workforce in agriculture is falling while the share of the workforce in industry and services is increasing. Well, the share of the workforce was in fact falling until 2019, the share. It had begun to fall more slowly post 2013, but it was still falling, which is a good thing. We now have 42% of our workforce in agriculture. It used to be in the year 2000 in the region of 60%. It's another matter that, China is at 30%, but it's still 42%. And the numbers have increased. How many times am I going to say this again and again and again, so that you understand that, what has happened through pandemic? Have you not watched television or not seen the newspapers that people went back? There are non-farm livelihoods, so they are probably looking for non-farm livelihoods in rural areas. But if aggregate demand is not there even in rural areas, why would there be that much more non-farm work? Please explain that to me. There's no jobs in e-commerce in rural areas. If you live in the city, you can walk in, you can open your internet and order from Flipkart. Are people in rural areas doing that? Parents don't have the money to buy smartphones. And if you don't have a smartphone and you can't be in school. Schools are closed. Sarkari schools in the whole country. Our children have lost a whole year of their lives. They're not in online classes, sir. Are they? Can they be? So why didn't we control the pandemic? Why didn't we vaccinate the school teachers first? If we had vaccinated the school teachers, we could have opened schools. No, but we didn't do that. Because we wanted to vaccinate the world before we vaccinated our own people. Are you aware that in UP alone, I've just learned this 2 days ago, 600 teachers have died of COVID? Why? Was that inevitable? Is this not genocide? Is this not a crime against humanity?
Thank you, sir. So we'll take one last question.
Yeah.
And कोविड-19 के कारण भारत में अगले एक साल में भी आर्थिक माहौल और खराब होने वाला है। ये हालत से से भारतीय अर्थव्यवस्था को बाहर निकालने के लिए क्या करना चाहिए?
4 बातें मैंने आपको बताई थी। आप पेपर फिर से पढ़िएगा। 4 बातें मैंने आपको बताई। इन सब से नौकरियां बढ़ेंगी, रोजगार बढ़ेगा, और रोजगार और पे तवज्जो देनी होगी हमारी सरकार को। मगर सरकार अगर ये कहती रहेगी कि हमारे तो जॉब्स बहुत बढ़ रहे हैं, हमारे तो जॉब्स में कोई प्रॉब्लम है ही नहीं, प्रॉब्लम ही नहीं है जॉब्स में। सरकार हमको ये बता रही थी, लगातार बता रही थी। वो तो दुर्भाग्यवश सीएमआई का डेटा निकलता रहता है हर महीने, और वो कुछ और बता रहा है। आपने आज तक क्या किसी सरकारी वक्तव्य में कुछ सुना है कि हम जॉब्स क्रिएट करने के लिए क्या कर रहे हैं, क्या करने वाले हैं? जॉब्स के बारे में एक शब्द कभी कोई नेता बोलता है? आप खुद बगल में झांक के देख लीजिए। You first have to recognize that a problem exists. You already had a massive problem in 2019. In 2019, the government didn't even release the NSS data. In January, February, when the data got leaked, the whole world came to know that unemployment was at 45-year high. But just a week after the election results were announced in 2019, the data was made available. Periodic labor force survey data was made available. The government was sitting on the data until after the election results, and it showed the numbers, the unemployment rates that I just talked about, of a tripling of the rate between 2012 and 2019. And since then, it has only worsened. So, question is, I'm saying repeatedly, please raise aggregate demand. पर्चा पढ़ लीजिए, मेहरबानी करके पर्चा पढ़िए.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I'll take 5 minutes to conclude the lecture.
Please do, please.
I would like to take this platform to appreciate the efforts of our resource person and expert, Professor Santosh Mehrotra sir, who have been kind enough to accept our invitation for this lecture and amid such difficult times we are facing and helping us to take our heads off this distress all around us. Every person here right now must be facing something or the other, and helping us bring our attention to the much needed issues that we must pay our attention to. So we thank you all heartedly for deeply engaging us in such an informative, explanatory and interactive session, sir. Thank you so much, sir. I would also like to appreciate the spirits and much enthusiastic zeal of our participants to learn, despite all the health and difficulties that we are seeing in these times. So thank you so much, everyone. I hope you and families stay safe, and much strength to the people who are fighting COVID. Thank you so much. And thank you, sir, once again, sir.
Thank you very much, Bhavna. All the best to you.
Thank
all your participants.
Thank you, sir. Ravinder sir, we'll conclude the session, sir. सर लाइव स्क्रीनिंग बंद कर देते हैं.